I stared at the wall while the air in the kitchen turned to ice. My parents skipped my graduation to go to a resort with my sister. I invited my best friend's parents instead. The film company honored them with $500,000 on live television. A few hours later, I had 78 missed calls. My mother didn't even look up from the glossy travel brochure. She just kept tracing the blue swimming pools with her manicured thumb. The silence was a heavy, physical thing. My sister Maya leaned against the counter, clutching her third iced coffee of the morning. She looked fragile, a carefully cultivated state that usually earned her the last piece of everything. My father adjusted his tie and spoke to my reflection rather than my face. He said Maya had been under so much stress lately. A weekend at the beach was a medical necessity, they claimed. I didn't yell or beg for my place. I simply watched a small spider crawl across the windowsill. They were already gone. The Gables kitchen smelled like real cinnamon and laundry detergent. It was a sharp contrast to the sterile, cold air of my own house. I sat at their wooden table, feeling the grain beneath my palms. When I told them the truth, the room went silent. Mrs. Gable didn't offer a platitude or a shallow hug. She simply set down her dish towel and looked at her husband. They didn't ask about the cost. They only asked what time they needed to arrive. The shift was permanent. College had been a long series of quiet, lonely victories. I paid my own tuition while my parents funded Maya's boutique lifestyle. They thought I was just a library ghost, drifting through a useless degree. They never asked about the scripts I wrote during the midnight hours. They didn't see the contracts I signed, or the way industry leaders spoke my name. I kept my success in a locked drawer. I learned that some secrets are safer when they are kept away from people who don't care. Graduation morning was bright and painfully clear. I adjusted my black gown in the mirror, feeling the weight of the heavy fabric. The Gables were already waiting in the front row, waving with genuine excitement. My phone buzzed with a photo of a tropical drink from my mother. I didn't reply. I just stepped onto the stage when the dean called my name. The lights were blinding, but I felt remarkably solid. The film executive walked toward the microphone with a gold envelope. The trap was finally set. The announcement shattered the polite silence of the auditorium. The executive called the Gables onto the stage, naming them as my primary investors and emotional foundation. A giant check appeared, and the Lev stream cameras zoomed in on their tearful faces. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation that felt like a tidal wave. My phone began to vibrate in my pocket, a relentless and frantic buzzing. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who was calling. The resort trip had suddenly become very expensive. We walked out of the auditorium into the blinding afternoon sun. The Gables were still shaking, their hands clutching the framed award like a holy relic. People I barely knew kept stopping me to offer congratulations. My phone was a hot brick in my pocket, pulsing with a life of its own. I felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. The world was spinning, but for the first time, I was the one holding the steady center. The restaurant was a small place with red checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic. We sat in a corner booth, tucked away from the noise of the street. Mr. Gable ordered a bottle of champagne to celebrate the massive grant. He kept looking at the check, his eyes moist and wide. He asked if I was sure about the money. I told him that presents has a price they finally paid. He just nodded and gripped my hand. My phone screen lit up on the table, showing 20 new messages in a single minute. My mother's profile picture flashed constantly, a smiling face that felt like a stranger's mask. Maya was texting too, her words sharp and frantic across the locked screen. She called me selfish for the public stunt. She claimed the resort trip was a family bonding exercise I ruined. I slid the device into my purse. The buzzing became a muffled, distant heartbeat. A local news reporter found us just as the appetizers arrived. She had a camera crew trailing behind her like a hungry pack of wolves. She asked for a comment on the live, streamed snub. She wanted to know if my parents were actually at the resort. I declined the interview with a polite, cold smile. The Gables looked uncomfortable under the bright camera lights. This was the cost of being seen. The private war was now public. The reporter leaned in, mentioning that my father had just posted a public apology online. He claimed there was a scheduling error with the travel agency. He said they were heartbroken to miss my big moment. The lie was so smooth it almost sounded like the truth. My stomach twisted, but I didn't break. I told the reporter that my family was already sitting at the table with me. The camera captured every word of my final rejection. After the crew left, a tall man in a dark suit approached our booth. He was the lead attorney for the film production company. He handed me a thick folder embossed with a silver logo. He explained that my parents had already called the corporate office. They were demanding a meeting to discuss the legal rights to my scripts. They wanted a percentage of the grant money. They were claiming parental investment. The predatory move was expected but vile. I signed the non-disclosure agreement the lawyer placed before me. I instructed him to block every communication attempt from my biological relatives. The Gables watched in silence as I severed the final ties. I wasn't the easy child anymore. I was a business. My phone gave one final, long vibration before the battery died. I felt a sudden, sharp relief. The silence was finally mine to keep. The door was locked from the inside now. The lawyer left the restaurant, leaving a trail of expensive cologne in the humid air. I looked at the thick folder and felt the cold reality of my victory. The Gables were quiet now, picking at their food with silver forks. They had never seen the sharp edge of my world before. Mrs. Gable reached out and squeezed my wrist. She asked if this meant I was safe. I couldn't answer that. The silence was getting louder. We walked to the parking lot, where the night air felt like a damp blanket. My car sat under a buzzing street lamp, looking smaller than I remembered. A black SUV was idling near the exit, its tinted windows hiding the driver. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The Gables insisted on following me home. I agreed because the shadows felt too long tonight. We drove through the city in a slow, somber parade. Inside my apartment, the air was stale and smelled of old coffee. I plugged my dead phone into the wall charger and waited for the screen to glow. When the power returned, the notifications flooded the room like a physical wave. My sister had posted a video of our mother crying in their hotel suite. She blamed my success for her sudden panic attack. It was a classic Maya move. The internet was already picking sides in the comments. I opened the folder the lawyer gave me and spread the documents on the floor. There were receipts I didn't recognize. My parents had been using my social security number to sign Maya's luxury loans for months. They hadn't just ignored my graduation. They had been quietly harvesting my credit to fund her lifestyle. My hand started to shake as the math clicked into place. This wasn't just neglect. It was a systematic, calculated betrayal of trust. The doorbell rang, a sharp and violent sound in the quiet room. I looked through the peephole and saw a face I hadn't seen in years. It was my Aunt Sarah, the family peacemaker who always smelled of peppermint. She wasn't smiling tonight. She looked tired and held a manila envelope against her chest. I didn't want to open the door. I knew she was a messenger for the people at the resort. She looked directly at the lens. I opened the door just a crack. Sarah didn't try to push her way inside the apartment. She just handed me the envelope and whispered that they were sorry. She said the resort trip was a mistake they couldn't undo now. I told her that apologizing for a choice is just a different kind of lie. She looked at the floor and admitted the loans were failing. Maya's car was about to be repossessed. They needed the grant money back. I realized then that they didn't want a daughter. They wanted a bank. I took the envelope and told Sarah to leave before I called the police. She walked away without looking back. I went back to my desk and looked at the $500,000 grant certificate. The money was legally tied to the Gables, not me. My parents had targeted the wrong people. Then I saw a new notification. A process server was at the Gables' front door. I grabbed my keys and sprinted back to my car. The Gables were innocent people caught in a crossfire. They didn't start. I called their home phone, but it went straight to a busy signal. My parents were weaponizing the legal system from their hotel room balcony. I drove through 3 yellow lights, my heart hammering against my ribs. They were trying to claw back the money by suing my chosen family. The desperation smelled like burnt rubber and fear. The Gables' front porch light was flickering when I pulled into their driveway. A man in a cheap suit was handing Mr. Gable a stack of blue papers. I jumped out of the car before the engine fully died. The process server didn't care about the backstory or the missing graduation. He just wanted his signature so he could go home. Mr. Gable looked aged, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the lawsuit. He was being served. I snatched the papers from the man's hand and scanned the dense legalese. My parents were claiming that the $500,000 grant was a misappropriation of family intellectual property. They argued that, because I lived in their house while writing, they owned the work. It was a baseless, predatory move meant to bleed the Gables dry. I looked at the man and told him to leave the property. He shrugged and walked toward his car without saying a word. We went inside and sat in their kitchen again, but the warmth was gone. The stack of blue papers sat on the table like a ticking bomb. Mr. Gable asked if they could really lose the money. I told him that I wouldn't let that happen, but my voice wavered. I realized that my silence wasn't enough to protect them anymore. I had to go on the offensive. I needed to expose the debt they hid from me. I opened the envelope Aunt Sarah had left and pulled out the secret bank statements. There was a specific signature on the newest loan document that caught my eye. It wasn't my father's messy scrawl or my mother's neat script. It was Maya's handwriting, but she had signed my name with perfect, practiced precision. My sister hadn't just benefited from the favoritism. She was actively committing identity theft to fund her lifestyle. The game had changed from neglect to crime. I showed the signature to the Gables and explained what it meant for the lawsuit. If I reported the fraud, the entire family structure would collapse into a criminal investigation. My parents were shielding a fill-on while trying to sue honest people for a gift. The power balance shifted in an instant. I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt like a predator. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the resort. My father finally answered. His voice was thick with fake concern as he asked why I was being so difficult. I told him to listen carefully and stop talking. I described the forged signature and the bank statement spread across the Gables table. I told him the lawsuit ended tonight, or Maya went to jail by morning. There was a long, terrifying silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard my mother screaming in the background. The resort trip was over. The silence on the line was cold enough to frost the glass in my hand. My father tried to bluster, claiming that family shouldn't use words like jail or fraud. I held the forged document under the kitchen light, watching the ink shimmer with betrayal. I told him that Maya's signature was a masterpiece of theft. He finally stopped talking. I could hear the distant sound of waves crashing outside their expensive hotel room. The distance between us felt like a canyon. My mother took the phone next, her voice trembling with a sharp, performative edge. She begged me to think of the family reputation and Maya's fragile mental state. I asked her who was thinking of my reputation when the process server arrived at the Gables. She didn't have an answer for that. She only wanted to know how much money it would take to make this go away. It was always about the transaction. They never once asked if I was okay. I demanded they sign a full confession regarding the forged loans and drop the frivolous lawsuit immediately. I wanted the documents notarized by the hotel staff and emailed to my lawyer within the hour. If the clock hit midnight without the files, I was heading to the police station. My father agreed, his voice sounding small and defeated for the first time. He realized his favorite child was a liability. The golden girl had finally lost her luster in his eyes. We sat in the kitchen, watching the clock on the stove tick toward the deadline. Mr. Gable made a pot of tea, but the steam felt like gray ghosts in the dim room. We didn't speak. The weight of what I had done to my own blood was heavy. I was destroying their world to save my own. It was a necessary cruelty, but it still tasted like ash. I felt older than I ever had before tonight. The email chime echoed through the quiet house at exactly 11:45. I opened the attachments and saw the signed confessions, witnessed by the resort's night manager. It was all there. They admitted to using my identity and promised to drop all claims against the Gables. I forwarded the files to my attorney with a single, steady tap. The legal threat was dead. The Gables were safe. I should have felt relieved, but I only felt remarkably hollow. Just as I started to breathe, a new message popped up from an unknown number. It was a video file. I pressed play and saw Maya standing on the resort balcony, the wind whipping her hair. She looked directly into the camera with eyes that were red and wide with fury. She told me that I had won the money, but I would never have a family again. Then she tossed her phone into the dark ocean. It was a final, dramatic exit. I stared at the black screen, realizing that Maya wasn't done playing the victim for our parents. She was going to use this defeat to tether them even closer to her side. They would spend the rest of their lives resenting my success and mourning her ruined life. The grant was secure, but the bridge was burned to the ground. Then my phone buzzed again. It was the film company. They had seen Maya's viral video. They were concerned. The film company representative was on the line, his voice tight with corporate anxiety. He asked if the video of Maya on the balcony would damage the project's marketability. I gripped the kitchen counter until my knuckles turned white. I told him the drama was a private family matter, not a professional one. He didn't seem convinced by my hollow assurance. He mentioned that the board was reconsidering the public nature of the grant. My entire career hung by a single, fraying thread. I looked at the Gables, who were watching me with deep, silent concern. I realized that my parents hadn't just targeted my money, they had targeted my future. If the film company pulled out, the Gables would lose everything I had just promised them. I had to pivot the narrative before the internet swallowed my reputation whole. I asked the executive for 1 hour to fix the mess. He gave me 30 minutes. The clock was a predatory beast in the quiet room. I sat down at the table and opened my laptop with trembling fingers. I didn't record a tearful apology or a defensive rant against my sister. Instead, I uploaded the scanned copies of the forged loan documents with the signatures clearly visible. I added the notarized confession my parents had sent from the resort. I hit the post button without a second of hesitation. The truth was a blunt instrument, and I was finally ready to swing it. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The tide of public opinion shifted as the evidence of identity theft went viral. People who had sympathized with Maya's dramatic balcony video were now dissecting her crimes. The film company called back within 10 minutes. Their tone suddenly warm and supportive. They loved the grit of the real story. They wanted to double the marketing budget for the project. I had traded my family's privacy for my own survival. Mrs. Gable put a hand on my shoulder as the notifications began to slow down. She asked if I was okay with the world knowing the dark details. I told her that secrets were the only thing keeping me small. I felt a strange, cold armor settling over my heart. I wasn't just a victim or a daughter anymore. I was the architect of my own life. Then my phone buzzed with a text from a local police detective. He asked if I wanted to move forward with formal charges against my sister. I looked at the gables and then at the empty hallway of the house. If I said yes, Maya would face years of legal consequences. If I said no, I was still protecting the person who tried to destroy me. I realized that my parents were already on a plane back to the city. They weren't coming home to talk. They were coming to fight. I knew their flight would touch down in hours, turning their desperation into a final, frantic assault on my resolve. I sat in the Gables' kitchen and felt the heavy weight of the detective's question. The fluorescent light hummed above us, casting long, sharp shadows across the blue legal papers. Reporting Maya meant a permanent end to my childhood home. I looked at the coffee ring on the table and felt a cold resolve. I told the detective I would provide the full statement tomorrow morning. He thanked me and disconnected, leaving me in a thick silence. I wasn't protecting her anymore. The girl I grew up with was officially gone. Rain began to lash against the windows as I drove back to my own apartment. The city lights were blurred, colorful streaks against the dark pavement. I saw a familiar car parked near my building's entrance. My parents were leaning against the damp metal, their faces pale under the yellow street lamp. They looked small and defeated without their resort backdrop. My father stepped forward, his hand raised in a weak gesture of peace. I didn't slow down as I pulled into my spot. The confrontation was finally here. They followed me to the elevator, their footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floor. My mother started talking about family loyalty before the doors even closed. She claimed that Maya was just young and confused by the pressure. I looked at her reflection in the brass panel and saw a stranger. I told her that confusion doesn't explain forging a legal signature. She flinched as if I had struck her. My father stood in the corner, staring at his shoes. The power had shifted completely. I was the one holding the keys. Inside my living room, the air felt thin and charged with static. I didn't offer them a seat or a drink. I simply placed the detective's business card on the glass coffee table. My father picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. He asked if I had actually spoken to the authorities yet. I told him that my statement was scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow. He looked at my mother, and I saw a silent, desperate communication pass between them. They were finally realizing that I wasn't bluffing. My mother tried a different tactic, mentioning the shared memories of my childhood. She spoke about my first writing prize and the way they cheered. I reminded her that they missed that ceremony to take Maya to a movie. Her face crumpled, but I felt nothing but a cold, hard clarity. The emotional bank account was empty. I told them that Maya needed to face the consequences of her theft. My father finally spoke, admitting they had no money left to help her. They were bankrupt. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. They had spent everything on Maya's lifestyle and the failed lawsuit attempt. They were losing the family house within the next 30 days. I realized then why they were so desperate for the grant money. It wasn't just about greed, it was about survival. They had gambled on the easy child and lost everything. I looked at the framed photos on my shelf and felt a sudden, sharp pity. They had destroyed themselves trying to save a ghost. I told them I would pay for a small apartment for them on one condition. They had to sign a document admitting they were never involved in my career. I wanted a total legal separation from their financial mess and Maya's crimes. My father nodded immediately, his eyes filled with a hollow gratitude. My mother just wept into her hands. They were willing to sell their loyalty for a roof. It was the saddest transaction I had ever witnessed. I felt a door close inside my chest. We sat in silence as I printed the agreement on my home office machine. The sound of the paper sliding out was the only noise in the room. They signed their names without reading the fine print. I realized I was now the guardian of the people who had abandoned me. It was a strange, heavy irony that I didn't want. I handed them the keys to a temporary rental I had secured. I told them to leave before I changed my mind. They walked out slowly. I stood by the window and watched their car pull away into the rainy night. My phone buzzed on the counter, but I didn't rush to pick it up. I knew it was the film company checking in again. I felt a sudden, strange sense of freedom. The ties were cut, and the debts were settled. I looked at my graduation cap sitting on the chair. I picked it up and tossed it into the trash. Then I saw a light flashing in the hallway. Someone was still there. I opened the door and found Maya standing in the hallway. Her expensive resort dress was stained with rain and salt. She looked frantic, her eyes darting toward the shadows behind me. She didn't have her phone or her pride left. She whispered that the police were already at the hotel looking for her. I realized she had fled before our parents could even reach the city. The sister I once envied was now a fugitive at my doorstep. She pushed past me into the living room, leaving wet footprints on the rug. She begged me to hide her just for one night. I stood by the open door and looked at her trembling hands. I told her the lie was over and the police were coming. She screamed that I was the one who ruined everything with my greed. I didn't feel anger, only a deep and final exhaustion. The sound of sirens began to rise from the street below. The blue and red lights splashed against the apartment walls like cold paint. Maya froze, her face pale under the harsh glare of the emergency strobes. She realized our parents hadn't warned her about the notarized confession I held. They had traded her freedom for a rental apartment and a quiet life. I watched the realization break her spirit in real time. She collapsed onto the sofa and started to sob. The knocking on the door was loud and rhythmic. I opened the door for the officers and stepped aside. They moved with a professional efficiency that made the room feel very small. They read Maya her rights, while she stared at the floor in silence. One officer asked if I was the victim of the identity theft. I looked at my sister, and then at the city lights outside. I nodded once, confirming the truth I had avoided for years. The handcuffs clicked shut with a final, metallic sound. We walked down to the lobby in a strange and solemn procession. My parents were sitting in their car across the street, watching the arrest. They didn't move to help her or even call out her name. They were already mourning the daughter they had created and lost. I felt the Gable's presence in my mind, a warm contrast to this coldness. Presence was the only thing that mattered. I had finally learned how to tell the difference. The morning sun began to rise over the skyline, gray and indifferent. I returned to my apartment and sat in the quiet of the dawn. My phone buzzed with a message from the film company about the final contract. I deleted the missed calls from the resort without reading them. I was finally the one who chose the seats at my own table. I closed my eyes and breathed in the silence. It was the first day of my life.